Living in a neighborhood with a power-hungry HOA president was already a nightmare, but Karen took it to another level. She wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was the rules. If she didn't like the color of your curtains, expect a letter. If she thought your grass was zero point 0.2 inches too tall, get ready for a fine. She would patrol the neighborhood like some self-appointed sheriff, clipboard in hand, taking pictures and notes about the slightest infractions. People whispered about her behind closed doors, but no one dared to challenge her outright. For the most part, I ignored her. I kept my house in good shape, paid my HOA dues on time, and avoided unnecessary interactions. But when she started fixating on my tree, I knew trouble was brewing. The tree was a massive old oak that had been standing in my backyard for decades, probably longer than most of the houses in the neighborhood. It was a thing of beauty, tall, strong, and full of life. The leaves provided much-needed shade in the sweltering summer, and its branches were home to birds, squirrels, and even the occasional raccoon. More than that, it had sentimental value. My dad planted it when he bought this house, and after he passed away, it became a part of him that still remained. Karen, of course, saw none of that. To her, the tree was an eyesore. She claimed it blocked the view from her second-story balcony, as if my backyard existed purely for her enjoyment. She insisted it was a hazard, saying that a storm could bring it crashing down, even though multiple arborists had confirmed it was completely healthy. She even tried to argue that the roots were creeping onto HOA property, which was laughable because they were nowhere near the sidewalk or the shared areas. At first, I thought it was just one of her usual power trips. I figured if I ignored her long enough, she'd move on to torment someone else. But Karen wasn't the type to let things go. One day, I came home to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my door. In bold capital letters, it read, "Tree must be removed immediately or fines will be issued." Below that, she had listed some ridiculous HOA regulation about landscaping uniformity, something I'd never seen enforced before. I wasn't about to let her bully me into cutting down a perfectly healthy tree, especially one that meant so much to me. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I lawyered up. I dug through the HOA bylaws, found nothing that justified her demand, and sent her a formal letter stating that she had no authority to force me to remove the tree. She didn't take it well. The next time I saw her, she was livid. Standing on my lawn with her arms crossed, she sneered, "You really think you can win this?" I kept my voice calm. "I'm just following the rules. Karen, the tree stays." Her eyes narrowed, and she let out a humorless chuckle. "You'll regret this." That should have been my warning. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of chainsaws. I bolted out of bed and ran outside, my heart hammering in my chest. To my horror, a team of workers was already halfway through cutting down my tree. Huge branches lay scattered across the yard. The air smelled of freshly cut wood. Karen stood at the edge of my property, smugly supervising the destruction like some kind of evil overlord. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. She barely spared me a glance. "Oh, good morning. I took care of your little problem for you. You'll thank me later." I saw red. "This is my property. You had no right." She waved me off. "Relax. I hired professionals. They know what they're doing. You'll get over it." I was about to call the police when something shifted. A deep, loud crack echoed through the air. One of the workers shouted something, and suddenly the tree, what was left of it, started to lean. Not toward my house. Toward hers. Chaos erupted in an instant. The workers scrambled, shouting warnings as the massive tree trunk creaked and groaned, tilting toward Karen's house. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. I saw Karen's smug expression melt into one of sheer panic. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened in a scream, but there was no stopping it now. Gravity had taken over. With a deafening crack, the remaining trunk gave way completely, and the tree came crashing down, straight onto Karen's pristine, HOA-approved beige-colored roof. The impact was explosive. Shingles shattered, wood splintered, and a massive hole burst open in the center of her house. Dust and debris filled the air as the workers stumbled backward, some ducking for cover. A section of the second floor collapsed inward, leaving behind a gaping wound in her once perfect home. For a moment, there was complete silence. Even the birds that had been nesting in the tree had vanished, as if they, too, were shocked at what had just happened. Then Karen let out an ear-piercing shriek. "My house! My house!" she wailed, stumbling forward, clutching her hair like she was about to rip it out. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I folded my arms, barely containing my fury. "What I've done? You cut down my tree without permission, on my property, and it fell. Actions have consequences, Karen." Her face twisted in rage. "This is your fault." "You." But before she could finish, one of the workers, a burly man in a high-visibility vest, stepped in. "Ma'am, we followed your instructions. You ordered us to cut it without checking the structural integrity." He gestured toward the fallen remains. "We told you there was a risk, but you didn't want to hear it." Karen turned on him like a rabid dog. "Don't you dare blame me! You're supposed to be professionals! How could you let this happen?" The man sighed, rubbing his temples. "Lady, we warned you, multiple times. We even suggested waiting for a permit to get clearance. But you said you run the HOA and didn't need one." He shook his head, clearly done with her nonsense. "This is on you." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned back to me, her face a shade of red that was quickly bordering on purple. You're gonna pay for this! You'll be held responsible." I let out a sharp laugh. "Oh no, Karen. You don't get to flip this on me. You trespassed. You destroyed my property. You ignored professional advice. This is all on you." She let out a furious scream, stomping her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. "I'm going to sue you for every penny you have. I'll make sure you regret the day you moved into this neighborhood." That was it. I pulled out my phone. "Great, let's get the police involved then. And while we're at it, I'll call my lawyer. Destruction of property, illegal trespassing, hiring unlicensed workers without a permit. Oh, and let's not forget reckless endangerment." I gestured toward the damage. "This tree could have killed someone, Karen. I wonder what the insurance company will think when they hear that part." Her face drained of color. The workers, realizing this was no longer their problem, started packing up their tools. The lead guy gave me a nod. "We'll be sending her the invoice," he muttered before walking off. Karen stumbled backward, her head shaking violently. No, this isn't happening. This can't be happening." "Oh, it's happening," I said, slipping my phone into my pocket. "And I'd start thinking about how you're going to explain this to your insurance company, because I guarantee they aren't covering damages caused by your stupidity." Just then, one of the neighbors, Mr. Thompson, a retired firefighter who had lived here for decades, poked his head over the fence. He had a cup of coffee in hand, looking entirely too amused by the scene before him. Well, he drawled. "Looks like karma works fast these days." Karen shot him a venomous glare, but he just chuckled. I could hear sirens in the distance. Someone must have called the police. Good, because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The sirens grew louder, their wailing piercing through the stunned silence of the neighborhood. Karen stood frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to come up with an excuse, a way out of the disaster she had created. But there was no talking her way out of this one. The evidence was right in front of her. A massive tree, the remains of her shattered roof, and an entire crew of workers who could testify that she had ordered the job without proper precautions. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, followed by a fire truck. The officers stepped out first, surveying the damage with raised eyebrows. One of them, a tall man with a no-nonsense expression, adjusted his belt and walked toward us. The fire crew wasn't far behind, already discussing the potential structural damage to Karen's home. "All right," the officer said, looking between us. "We got a call about a tree collapse. Someone want to explain what happened?" Karen, desperate to regain control of the situation, immediately pointed at me. "It was his tree. He refused to remove it, and now it's destroyed my house. He should be arrested for negligence." I scoffed. "Nice try, Karen. Why don't you tell them the part where you illegally hired workers to trespass on my property and cut down my tree without permission?" The officer turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, is that true?" Karen faltered, her lips pressing into a thin line. That tree was a hazard. I was acting in the interest of the HOA and the safety of the neighborhood. He refused to listen, so I had to step in." One of the workers, still standing nearby, let out a dry laugh. She hired us without a permit, ignored every safety warning, told us to just cut it down quickly. He gestured toward the wreckage. That's why this happened. The officer sighed, pulling out a notepad. All right, let's break this down. Sir, the tree was on your property? Yes, I confirmed, and I have documentation proving I denied any requests to remove it. The officer nodded and turned back to Karen. And you ordered workers onto his property without his permission? Karen's eyes darted back and forth, looking for a way out. It's my job to enforce HOA regulations, she snapped. He was being unreasonable. I had to take action before someone got hurt. The officer let out a long sigh as if he had dealt with people like Karen before. Ma'am, you can't trespass on private property and alter someone's land without consent. That's destruction of property. Depending on the cost of damages, this could be a serious charge. Karen's face paled. But it was just a tree. An expensive, mature oak, I interjected. And now it's your problem. You damaged your own house by cutting it down recklessly. One of the firefighters chimed in. The structural damage to her home is bad. If there's electrical wiring under there, she could have a fire hazard too. We'll need to inspect it. Karen looked like she was on the verge of a breakdown. No, you can't do this. This is his fault. The officer ignored her outburst and looked at me again. Would you like to press charges for trespassing and destruction of property? The question sent a ripple of murmurs through the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. I could see some of them trying to hide their smirks, others shaking their heads at Karen's audacity. I let the moment stretch, making sure she felt the weight of it. Then I smiled. Oh, absolutely. Karen let out a strangled gasp. You can't. The officer was already making notes. You'll need to provide any documentation you have, and we'll conduct a full investigation. He turned back to Karen. Ma'am, you may be looking at some hefty fines and possible legal action. I suggest you contact a lawyer. She looked ready to explode. You can't do this to me. I am the HOA president. I'll have your badge for this. The officer didn't even flinch. Ma'am, step back while we finish our report. The fire chief gave a final warning. And you might want to stay somewhere else tonight. Your house isn't safe to live in until we assess the damage. Karen let out a shriek of frustration, but she had no moves left. I turned to head back inside, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction as the officers continued questioning her. For once, Karen wasn't in control. And it was about time. Karen's shriek of frustration echoed through the neighborhood as the officer continued writing in his notepad. I stood with my arms crossed, watching as she cycled through every stage of rage and denial. Her face was flushed red, her fists clenched at her sides, and she kept shaking her head as if refusing to believe this was really happening. This is ridiculous, she snapped. I was doing my job. This tree was dangerous. I was preventing a disaster. The officer didn't even look up from his notes. Ma'am, the only disaster here is the one you caused. A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered. Karen's house was a wreck. Her perfect beige palace now had a gaping hole in the roof, with jagged wooden beams and insulation spilling out like exposed nerves. Shattered shingles littered her front yard, and part of the second-floor balcony had collapsed inward. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen, an older woman from 2 doors down, said, shaking her head, You can't just do whatever you want and expect no consequences. Karen spun toward her, eyes wild. Stay out of this, Linda, she snapped. This has nothing to do with you. Linda raised an eyebrow. It has everything to do with all of us. You've been running this HOA like a dictatorship for years. Now, look where that got you. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but she had no comeback. The reality of the situation was settling in, and it was clear she was losing whatever grip she thought she had. Meanwhile, one of the firefighters finished his preliminary inspection and approached us, dusting off his hands. Well, I've got bad news and worse news, he said, looking directly at Karen. She stiffened. What do you mean? Bad news is, the structural integrity of your house is compromised. The tree didn't just take out the roof. It damaged the support beams. You're looking at serious repairs. He glanced toward the power lines. And worse news? There's exposed wiring under the collapse. We have to shut off the electricity to prevent a fire hazard. Karen let out a strangled noise. No, you can't. I live here. The firefighter shrugged. Then I hope you enjoy living in a fire trap. At that moment, a sleek black SUV pulled up and a sharply dressed man stepped out, adjusting his tie. His presence alone sent a visible shudder through Karen. I didn't recognize him at first, but when he locked eyes with her and her face turned ghostly pale, I realized who he was. Her insurance adjuster. Oh, this is going to be good, I muttered under my breath. Karen tried to regain some level of control, smoothing her hair as she walked up to the man. Oh, thank God you're here. There's been a horrible accident, and I need my insurance claim processed immediately. My home. But the adjuster raised a hand, cutting her off. Mrs. Simmons, he said coolly, glancing at the wreckage, we've already been informed about the situation. Before we move forward, I need to clarify something. Was this tree removal done with a proper permit? Karen faltered. Well, No permit, the lead worker cut in. She hired us under the table, told us she didn't need paperwork. The adjuster's face didn't change, but there was something sharp in his eyes now. I see. And was this tree on her property? No, I said, stepping forward. It was on mine. She trespassed and had it cut down illegally. The adjuster let out a slow breath and pulled out his tablet, tapping a few notes. Mrs. Simmons, he said, based on what I'm hearing, I'm afraid your homeowner's policy won't cover this. Karen's eyes nearly bulged out of her skull. What? Insurance doesn't cover damage caused by illegal activity, he explained. Since you trespassed and ordered unauthorized work, this is entirely on you. The cost of repairs? All out of pocket. It was like watching a balloon deflate. Karen stumbled back, looking like she might faint. She opened her mouth to argue, but for the first time, no words came out. I let out a satisfied breath and turned to the officer. Can I add reckless endangerment to my report? Karen's head snapped toward me. You wouldn't. Oh, I would, I smirked. And I am. The officer jotted it down without hesitation. That's another charge, then. Karen let out a choked gasp and turned away, her entire world crumbling faster than her house. And for once, there was nothing she could do about it. Karen stood frozen, her hands shaking as reality crashed down on her just as hard as the tree had on her house. The officer continued writing in his notepad. The firefighter was coordinating the shutdown of her home's electricity, and her insurance adjuster had just sealed her fate. No coverage, no payout, nothing. She was on her own. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the wreckage, her mouth slightly open like she was trying to process what had just happened. But there was no way out of this. No HOA rule could save her. No amount of yelling or threats could undo the fact that she had destroyed her own house with her own arrogance. The small crowd of neighbors that had gathered stood in awkward silence, though a few exchanged amused glances. I could practically hear the collective thought running through their heads. Finally, she got what she deserved. Then, just when I thought Karen couldn't possibly embarrass herself more, she let out a furious scream. This isn't over, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. You did this to me. I'll take you to court. I'll get the HOA to fine you into the ground. Karen, the officer interrupted, his voice firm. You need to stop. No, you don't understand. She whirled to face him, wild-eyed. I run this neighborhood. I make the rules. No, you don't, a voice cut in. The crowd turned, and I had to suppress a grin when I saw who had spoken. Mr. Hadders Thompson, the retired firefighter who had been living here long before Karen even set foot in the neighborhood. He stepped forward, arms crossed, his face lined with years of experience dealing with people exactly like her. Karen, you've been lording over this HOA like a dictator for years, he said. Bullying people, fining them for nonsense, making up rules that only seem to apply when it benefits you. He nodded toward the wreckage. But now, you've gone and destroyed your own home because you thought you were above the law. Karen's nostrils flared. No, Mr. Thompson cut her off. You don't get to talk. You've spent years making life miserable for everyone here. Now look at you. Karen turned in a slow circle, her chest heaving as if she was just now realizing how many of her neighbors had gathered to watch her downfall. Some had their arms crossed, others whispered to each other. A few were even taking pictures of the scene. One woman in the back muttered, "Karma works fast." Karen let out a shaky breath and clenched her fists. Then suddenly she turned on her heel and stormed toward her house, What was left of it anyway? "Where do you think you're going?" the officer asked. Karen didn't stop. "Inside. I have to." The firefighter quickly stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ma'am, I just told you the house is unsafe. You cannot go inside." She spun around. "Then where am I supposed to go?" Silence. That's when it hit her. She had just lost everything. Her power, her reputation, her home, and she had no one to blame but herself. Her breath came in quick, panicked gasps as she turned back to me. You have to fix this. You have to." I raised an eyebrow. "I have to?" I let out a low chuckle. "No, Karen, I don't have to do anything. You did this to yourself." For a moment, she just stood there, shaking. Then, without another word, she turned and ran down the street, disappearing into the distance. A beat of silence. Then someone let out a low whistle. "Well," Mr. Thompson muttered, sipping his coffee, "that was dramatic." The officer finished writing his report and handed me a copy. "We'll be in touch about the charges. If she comes back and tries anything else, call us." I nodded. "Will do." As the emergency responders packed up and left, the neighbors slowly began to disperse, still murmuring about what had just happened. Linda, the neighbor Karen had snapped at earlier, walked up to me with a satisfied smile. "You know," she said, "I think the HOA might need a new president." I smirked. "I think you're right." And with that, I turned and walked back inside, leaving the wreckage of Karen's downfall behind me.